If you've ever had a roommate, you know that the physical person moving into your spare bedroom is, well, they're a constant.
Yeah, these are
Like, they take up space, they breathe, they exist in your house. But whether living with that person turns out to be a total financial lifesaver or an absolute complete nightmare, it actually has very little to do with them physically.
right. It's not about the person.
No. It depends almost entirely on the lease agreement you drew up before they brought their boxes inside.
Hmm?
Like, did you agree to split the utilities? Who's paying for the internet? Are they covering half the groceries? Or are they just, eating your food out of the fridge every night?
Yeah. The human being in the room hasn't fundamentally changed, but the rules governing how you interact with them, the paperwork, basically, that dictates your entire experience of living together.
Exactly. And welcome to the deep dive. Our mission today is to decode the massive, invisible physical infrastructure that is currently powering this whole global AI and cloud boom.
Right.
And we're doing this using an incredibly detailed, just eye-opening document called the Data Center Question. And if you follow the news at all, you know that people usually argue about data centers in these very binary terms.
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
They're either, the glorious engines of the future economy, or they are these evil resource vampires that are just destroying rural America.
Right, there's no in-between in the public debate.
Exactly. But after going through these sources, I realized that entire framing it's completely missing the point.
Yeah, it's the wrong argument entirely. Because a data center, just like that roommate you mentioned, is just an entity taking up space. It's a building. And if we want to understand the actual impact of this AI boom, we have to introduce the central idea that everything else we're going to unpack today hangs on.
And where does that?
The building is a constant. The paperwork is the variable.
The building is a constant. The paperwork is the variable.
Okay, I want to make sure we really nail down exactly what that means before we go any further. Because when you say the paperwork is the variable, what are we actually talking about on the ground?
Yeah.
Like in reality?
Right. So it means that two neighboring counties, like right next door to each other, could permit identically sized, identical-looking data center facilities.
Okay.
They could hold the exact same number of servers running the exact same artificial intelligence models.
Right.
Physically identical.
Got it.
Yet, one county could end up incredibly wealthy from it, and the other could end up functionally bankrupt and literally out of water.
Wow. Wait, really? From the exact same building?
Yes.
Yeah.
Because the consequences of these massive facilities, they're determined by local tax schedules, zoning laws, interconnection agreements, municipal water contracts. It is not about the physical servers humming in the dark. It's about the transaction that the community agreed to in order to get them there in the first place. Okay, so the building is a constant, the paperwork is the variable. I mean, we are going to say that a lot today because it really is the Rosetta Stone for this entire debate.
It really is.
And to prove that the paperwork dictates the outcome, I think we just have to look at two very different approaches to taxing the exact same types of buildings. So let's talk about the economic bargain that these towns are making.
Yeah, and to do that, we need to look at a tale of two jurisdictions here. Loudoun County, Virginia, and the state of Georgia.
Okay.
Now, Loudoun County is widely considered the data center capital of the world.
Right. Everyone knows Loudoun.
Yeah. And there's a specific reason why it worked out so well for them financially. It comes down to two numbers that you really need to memorize right off the bat. It's $4.15 and $0.805, or 80.5 cents.
Okay, so 4.15 and 0.805. Those numbers represent tax rates, right? And this is where you really start to see the genius of Loudoun's paperwork. Because Loudoun taxes the computer equipment inside the data center at $4.15 per $100 of assessed value.
Right.
That falls under personal property tax. But the real estate itself, like the physical building and the land it sits on, that is taxed at just 0.805 per $100 of value.
And that ratio between the equipment tax and the real estate tax is the whole ballgame.
Yeah.
Because to understand why, you have to visualize what a data center actually is physically.
Right.
It's not a low-tree high-rise office building with, marble floors and a giant lobby.
Yeah.
It's not a bustling shopping mall. A data center building is essentially a tilt-up concrete bunker. It's a highly secure, heavily air-conditioned warehouse. That's it.
Right. It's a shell.
Exactly. The multi-million-dollar servers packed inside are the actual valuable asset. So a jurisdiction that only taxes the real estate has effectively given away everything of value. They've just kept a concrete shell on their tax rolls.
Man, when you put it like that, it's so obvious. So by targeting the equipment with that 415 personal property tax, Loudoun County basically acquired the most financially productive taxpayer in human history.
Basically, yeah.
Because think about it from a local government perspective.
Right.
These facilities generate massive, massive tax revenue, and they send absolutely zero kids to the local public schools.
Right. No schools, no extra burden.
They don't require new teachers,
Yeah.
they don't need new school buses or new parks or rec centers. Because they captured the value of the servers, Loudoun County was actually able to cut residential property tax rates for their citizens for 10 years straight.
Yeah, they actually created a dedicated revenue stabilization fund just to manage the overflow of data center cash.
That's a good problem to have.
Right. They built a system where the AI boom directly subsidized the local residents. But, to see the other side of this coin, we have to pivot to Georgia,
Okay.
which serves as a fascinating cautionary tale in the source material.
Because Georgia took the exact opposite approach, right?
They did. They offered massive sales tax exemptions to lure developers into the state.
Okay, but I can hear people defending that already, though. The standard argument that you always hear is that you have to offer tax breaks or the developers will just build in another state, right?
Yeah.
Like you have to play the incentive game to win.
Right, that is the standard defense.
Yeah.
But it brings us to another crucial number from the sources, which is 70%.
Okay, 70%.
Yeah. In December 2025, the state of Georgia published a rather brutal audit of their own tax exemption program.
Oh, man. State audits are never fun.
No, they're not.
Mm-hmm.
And the auditors looked at what's called the but-for question.
The before question.
Yeah, as in, would this massive data center have been built here but for this tax break?
Ah, okay. Like, did the tax break actually move the needle?
Exactly. And the state's own audit found that 7 out of 10 data center projects, so 70%, would have come to Georgia without the tax exemption anyway.
Wow. 70%. That is staggering.
Right.
Because Georgia already had the things tech companies actually need. They had relatively cheap power. They had extensive fiber optic networks already in the ground from Atlanta being this huge hub. And they had plenty of available buildable land.
Exactly. Which means the tax break wasn't an incentive at all.
Right.
It was simply a discount on a business decision the tech companies had already made.
Oh, man.
Georgia was essentially paying companies hundreds of millions of dollars in foregone revenue for something they were already going to do.
So if 70% of those projects were arriving regardless, you aren't incentivizing economic development at all. You are literally just transferring public wealth to a private tech company.
That is exactly what the audit concluded. And this brings us right back to our core thesis.
The paperwork.
Yeah, exactly. The concrete building in Loudoun County and the concrete building in Georgia might hold the exact same hyperscale servers, processing the exact same algorithms. But because the paperwork, the tax code was written differently, Loudoun County fully funds its local government, while Georgia leaves hundreds of millions of dollars on the table.
It's wild. Okay, so Loudoun figured out how to extract massive wealth from these buildings by taxing the servers. But that wealth isn't free, because to run those servers, you have to plug them in.
You do.
And that brings us to the hidden costs that jurisdictions really have to grapple with. Because if the financial impact of a data center depends on the tax paperwork, the physical impact depends on the grid paperwork.
And the scale of the change we are seeing on the electrical grid is, it's hard to overstate.
Yeah.
For about 20 years, American electricity demand was incredibly boring.
Just flat.
Essentially flat.
Yeah.
Any economic growth we had was offset by things like, LED light bulbs and more efficient refrigerators and appliances.
Right. We got better at using it, so demand stayed level.
Exactly. But the artificial intelligence boom completely shattered that flat line. And to understand the regional problem this is causing, the document points us to PJM interconnection.
Okay, let's stop there for a second because we definitely need to define that. What exactly is PJM?
So PJM is a regional transmission organization. They are basically the air traffic controllers for the power grid across 13 states,
Okay.
stretching from Illinois all the way to New Jersey and Virginia. So it covers a massive chunk of the country. They don't actually own the power plants, but they manage the wholesale electricity market and ensure the grid stays reliable.
Okay, and to keep it reliable, they run what's called a capacity auction.
Yes.
Break that down for me because I know this is where the numbers get really wild in the source material.
Right, so a capacity auction is not a market for electricity itself.
Okay.
You aren't buying the actual electrons that turn on your lights today. It's a market for promises.
Promises. Okay.
Yeah. PJM is paying power generators, like natural gas plants or nuclear facilities, to guarantee that they will be available to produce power 3 years from now, specifically for when the system hits its absolute peak demand.
Like the hottest day of the summer when everyone's AC is on.
Exactly. Think of it like keeping a fleet of tow trucks on a highly paid retainer. You hope you don't need them all, but you are paying for the guarantee that they will show up if a blizzard hits and everyone's stuck in a ditch.
Got it. So they're buying future reliability. And what happened to the price of that reliability?
Well, over the course of just 3 auction cycles, PJM's capacity clearing prices absolutely skyrocketed. They jumped from $28.92 per megawatt day all the way to $333.44 per megawatt day.
Okay, a megawatt day. Just to give our listeners a sense of scale, a single megawatt of capacity is enough to power roughly 750 homes.
Right.
So paying $333 to keep that megawatt on standby for a single day, multiplied across the entire grid for a whole year, that is an astronomical amount of money.
It is. It's huge. And the situation actually deteriorated further because in their December 2025 auction, PJM came up 6,625 megawatts short of the reliability target.
Right, short.
Short. Let that sink in. For the first time in the market's history, they offered the absolute maximum price cap, and they still couldn't buy enough promised power to meet their safety margins. Nobody had it to sell.
Oh, man.
And PJM's own independent market monitor looked at this and attributed roughly 63% of that massive price spike directly to data center load growth. The grid is simply running out of spare capacity to sell.
Okay, now this is exactly the point in the conversation where the internet discourse usually goes completely off the rails.
Really?
So I want to step in and point out a massive trap to avoid for anyone listening. If you are following this debate online or in the news, you will inevitably see a viral claim going around that data centers caused residential power bills to rise by 267%.
Yep, I've seen that one.
Do not repeat that number. You cannot repeat that number because it is a complete misrepresentation of the data.
It's a critical distinction to make. That 267% figure applies strictly to wholesale capacity prices, which is what we were just talking about with PJM.
Right. And wholesale supply costs are only one fraction of what you actually pay on your monthly home utility bill. When you look at the actual U.S. residential rates, they rose about 42% over a 5-year period.
Which is still painful.
It's very painful, but it is nowhere near 267%. In fact, Senator Elizabeth Warren actually got fact-checked heavily in the media on this exact point because she repeated that wholesale number as if it was the residential number.
Yeah. We have to go a step further because you really can't blame data centers for all of that 42% increase either.
Right.
The sources point out that utility companies requested $31 billion in rate hikes in 2025 alone. And a massive chunk of that money was for things entirely unrelated to tech companies. It was for storm recovery, wildfire mitigation out west, and replacing aging, century-old infrastructure.
And Georgia Power is the perfect example of this. They asked for a $900 million rate increase, and the public narrative immediately pointed the finger at data centers. You know, AI is raising our bills.
Of course.
But if you look at the actual filings, that rate hike was largely about paying off debt incurred from hurricane damage.
Exactly.
Blaming AI for every single cent of a rate hike lets utility companies completely off the hook for their own infrastructure issues and their own climate impacts.
Which brings us to one of the most counterintuitive, fascinating moments of credibility in this entire deep dive. Because if we want to understand the true impact on the grid, we have to look at the inconvenient half of the data center argument. The part that the critics don't really want to talk about.
Yes, I was blown away by this when I read it in the sources. At the national level, there is actually a negative correlation between electricity load growth and price hikes.
It sounds impossible at first glance, I know.
It really does.
But states that had the fastest growth in electricity sales over the last decade actually saw the smallest rate increases for consumers. In fact, some of those fast-growing states even saw residential prices fall slightly.
Okay, how does that actually work mechanically? Because it just defies basic supply and demand logic, right? If demand goes up, prices should go up.
It defies basic logic until you realize how a power grid is funded. Grids are defined by massive, unavoidable fixed costs. Building a high-voltage transmission line across a mountain range, maintaining a nuclear-based generation plant, these things cost hundreds of millions of dollars. And they cost the exact same amount to maintain whether the grid is running at 50% capacity or 90% capacity.
Oh, I see. It's like chartering a massive tour bus. Like, the cost to rent the bus is $1,000 for the day, whether you put 5 people on it or 50 people on it.
Exactly. If you only have 5 passengers, the ticket price per person is exorbitant. But if a massive new group shows up and fills every empty seat on that bus, the per-person cost drops dramatically.
Okay.
So when a hyperscale data center connects to the grid, and remember, we are talking about facilities the size of shopping malls, and they pay for massive amounts of power 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, those massive fixed costs of the grid are suddenly spread out across millions of additional kilowatt hours. It effectively lowers the per-unit burden on the average homeowner.
So if the paperwork is right and the utility is charging them a fair rate for their connection, a data center can theoretically make the grid cheaper to run for everyone else.
Precisely. If the paperwork is right.
Ah.
But that leads us directly to the real villain in the electricity debate, the thing that is actually breaking the system right now, phantom load.
Okay, let's use an analogy to explain phantom load, because it is infuriating once you really understand it.
It really is.
Imagine a very wealthy VIP calls up a high-end restaurant and says, "Hey, I am reserving your entire dining room this Friday for a massive private party."
Okay.
The restaurant owner is thrilled, obviously. They go out and buy thousands of dollars worth of expensive steaks and wine. They hire extra waiters on overtime, and they have to turn away all their regular loyal customers who call for reservations. But then Friday night rolls around, and the VIP is a total no-show. They never arrive.
And crucially, in this scenario, the VIP never signed a contract with cancellation fee.
Right.
They just walk away. No penalty.
So the VIP pays absolutely nothing. How does the restaurant owner survive that kind of financial hit? They only have one option. For the next month, they have to raise the prices on the menu for all the regular, everyday diners just to cover the cost of all that wasted food and labor.
And that dynamic is exactly what is happening with phantom load on the power grid.
Wow.
Because grid operators like PJM have to plan years in advance. You cannot build a new high-voltage transmission line in the 3 weeks between a tech company signing a lease and plugging in their servers. It takes years.
Right.
So when a data center developer files an interconnection request for a massive new campus, the grid operator puts that projected load into its long-term forecast. Under the current rules in a lot of places, the grid operator is then legally obligated to go out and buy capacity and build infrastructure to serve that forecasted demand.
But tech developers are notoriously speculative. Right.
Very. They will often file multiple interconnection requests across different states for different sites just to keep their options open.
Yeah.
They might only intend to build one single facility, but they ask for grid upgrades at 4 different locations.
Man. And if those projected data centers are never built, if the VIP no-shows, nobody gets refunded. The developer abandons the project, and the everyday ratepayers are left footing the bill for a massive electrical substation that is sitting in an empty field doing nothing. Your monthly electric bill goes up to pay for infrastructure that was built for a ghost.
It is the most defensible, legitimate complaint in the entire data center debate, and frankly, almost nobody defends the other side of it. It is pure corporate speculation subsidized by the public.
Yeah.
It actually became such a glaring systemic risk that the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, FERC, they actually had to step in.
Yeah.
They demanded that grid operators rewrite their cost recovery agreements so that large, speculative customers remain financially responsible for the infrastructure built on their behalf, even if they never build the facility.
Again, the building is a constant, but the paperwork is the variable. If the contract says you pay a non-refundable deposit for the substation you ordered, the phantom load problem vanishes overnight.
Exactly.
It's a completely solvable issue. But, power isn't the only resource causing tension here. We need to talk about the physical byproduct of all that electricity, because power generates heat, and heat has to be removed.
It does.
And that brings us to the visual that I think makes people the angriest in this whole debate.
Water consumption.
Yeah, it is a powerful, just visceral image, a massive windowless corporate building drinking millions of gallons of fresh water a day while the local farming town goes into emergency drought restrictions. But the popular framing here is entirely backward, and we need to drop the number that stops the argument in its tracks right now. Data centers account for just 0.2% of total U.S. water consumption.
0.2%.
0.2%. Just to give you a sense of scale, a single mature almond orchard uses 1 million gallons of water an acre in a single season. Golf courses in America use roughly 2 billion gallons of water every single day just to keep the grass green.
Yeah.
So the national narrative that tech companies are, draining America dry, it's factually cold. It's just not true on a macro level.
Right. But, and this is a vital distinction, water is not a national resource.
Okay, what do you mean?
It's a highly localized resource.
Ah, right.
A surplus of water in Michigan
Yeah.
does absolutely nothing to help a drought in Arizona, which raises the fundamental question.
Huh?
Why do data centers use water at all?
Yeah, why do they?
The reframe the document provides here is brilliant, I think. Water use in a data center is a design choice, not physics.
I want to push on that a bit, actually. What do you mean it's not physics? Because servers generate massive amounts of thermal energy.
Yes.
That heat has to go somewhere, otherwise the equipment literally melts down. I mean, that is thermodynamics. That's physics.
The need to remove the heat is thermodynamics, you're right. The method they use to remove it is a design choice. You can cool a data center using air cooling. That involves massive fans and chillers moving air across the servers. It uses almost zero water.
Okay.
But it requires a tremendous amount of electricity to run those massive fans.
Yeah.
Alternatively, you can use evaporative cooling. This utilizes the physics of phase change, which is a fancy way of saying that when liquid water turns into vapor, it absorbs a massive amount of heat energy.
Oh, like sweating. It's the exact same reason humans sweat when we get hot.
Exactly. The evaporation cools you down incredibly efficiently. But of course, it consumes millions of gallons of water to do it at an industrial scale.
Okay, so fully air-cooled facilities exist, and they use almost zero water.
They do. They exist all over the place. Tech operators choose evaporative cooling, not because it's the only technological option available, but because they are constantly balancing the price of electricity against the price of water on a spreadsheet. They pick evaporative cooling because, in most places in the U.S., power is expensive and water is virtually free.
This is blowing my mind. So if a data center uses evaporative cooling in a desert community where water is naturally scarce, they are only doing that because the local municipality priced the water as if it were incredibly abundant.
Precisely. If they're wasting water, it is a local pricing failure that predates the data center arriving by decades. If water is a precious, scarce resource, it should be priced like a precious resource. The data center developer is just responding to the economic signal the county sent them through their municipal paperwork.
Oh, man. We are back to the lease agreement with the roommate.
Yep.
If you don't charge them for the water bill, they are going to take 2-hour showers every day.
Every single day. And to prove that this is an entirely solvable design choice, the document highlights a specific case study in Quincy, Washington.
Yeah, Quincy is a fascinating story. It's a relatively arid agricultural town, relies heavily on groundwater, and Microsoft decided to put a massive data center campus there. Now, in most scenarios, that ends with the town's aquifer being completely drained.
But Microsoft and the city partnered to build the Quincy Water Reuse Utility. It is a massive, highly complex, closed-loop water reuse system. It basically takes industrial wastewater from the town, treats it, chemically removes all the salts and minerals, and uses that reclaimed water for the data center's cooling towers.
Oh, and the result was staggering. It reduced the data center's draw on city drinking wells to almost nothing. It was something like 11,000 gallons a year, which is essentially just the water for the employee bathrooms.
Wow.
But here's the crucial takeaway from Quincy. That closed-loop system took 14 years and $31 million to build.
And that timeline is everything. 14 years. It proved the problem is entirely solvable with engineering, but it requires massive capital, a willing corporate partner, and an immense amount of foresight and patience from the local government.
Which you cannot conjure out of thin air during a rushed 90-day county zoning review. If a tiny town council gets an application today and they don't already have the regulatory framework to demand a $30 million water reuse facility, they just get evaporative cooling that drains their aquifer. The paperwork has to be written years before the developer ever knocks on the door.
Absolutely. Okay, let's transition from the resources flowing into the building to the physical reality of the site itself. We are seeing this massive global infrastructure being forced through local rural zoning boards. What actually happens when one of these lands next to someone's house?
Yeah, the reframe here is all about timing, and it totally shifted my perspective on this. People naturally assume the environmental and social impact of a data center happens while it's operating, but an operating data center is actually a remarkably quiet, unobtrusive industrial neighbor. It has no smokestacks, it produces no toxic runoff, it generates almost zero daily truck traffic because there is no physical inventory to move, and it requires very few employees on site.
Right.
Compared to a meat rendering plant or a massive Amazon distribution warehouse with constant 18-wheeler traffic, a data center is a ghost town.
The real environmental and social impact is the construction phase.
Exactly.
That is when the chaos happens. The dynamite blasting through bedrock, the grading of hundreds of acres of earth, the constant diesel dust, the heavy truck traffic tearing up rural two-lane roads.
Which creates a unique, incredibly toxic political dynamic. It creates maximum disruption for the surrounding community at the exact moment of minimum compensation. All the headaches, the noise, the dust, the road closures, they all happen for 2 to 3 years before a single dollar of that property tax revenue is actually generated for the town budget. The neighbors' opinions harden into pure hatred while they are suffering through construction long before the financial benefits ever arrive.
And to anchor this in a real human experience, the source document details a story from Newton County, Georgia, that perfectly illustrates this asymmetry.
Yes, the story of the Morris family. This one really stuck with me.
Me too.
Beverly and Jeff Morris are a retired couple living about 1,000 feet from a site where Meta, Facebook's parent company, decided to build a $750 million data center campus. Now, months after the heavy construction started, the Morrises noticed their well water pressure dropping significantly. Then their appliances started failing. Their dishwasher, their ice maker, their washing machine all broke because their drinking well had filled up with thick sediment.
Oh, gosh.
They had to spend $5,000 out of pocket just replacing broken appliances. And ultimately, they were told they need another $25,000 to drill an entirely new well.
And naturally, they blame the massive dynamite blasting and heavy earth moving at the Meta site next door for fracturing the bedrock and disturbing the groundwater.
Right. I mean, it makes logical sense. But Meta commissioned their own environmental study and concluded it was, quote, unlikely that the data center construction caused the well failure. Now, here is the honest, brutal punchline of this entire story. Nobody knows for sure if Meta ruined that well because nobody took a pre-construction baseline well test.
And that, the tragedy of missing paperwork right there. Causation in shallow groundwater systems is genuinely difficult to prove scientifically after the fact. Without a baseline test showing exactly what the water quality and sediment levels were before the dynamite started, the dispute is permanently unresolvable.
And think about the scale of the failure here. A baseline well test costs maybe a few $100s. It is a literal rounding error on a $750 million construction project. It is pocket change.
Yeah.
But because the county's zoning paperwork didn't mandate baseline testing for adjacent properties, the entire burden of proof fell on a retired couple. They were left to fight a $500 million global corporation entirely on their own, armed with nothing but a broken dishwasher.
It perfectly illustrates the information asymmetry between tech giants and local communities. But, keeping with our theme of looking at the data rather than just the emotion, let's look at another environmental panic during construction that turned out very differently.
Right, our second moment of credibility. We have to talk about the backup generators in Memphis. Because if you just look at the permits, you would think the air was turning to poison.
So XAI, which is Elon Musk's artificial intelligence company, was building a massive supercomputer facility in Memphis. And while they were waiting for the local utility to connect grid power, they installed a massive fleet of gas-powered turbines to get the servers running.
And if you look at the environmental permits for those turbines, the numbers are terrifying. They were permitted by the state to emit up to 87 tons of nitrogen oxides and 9.8 tons of formaldehyde.
Wow.
Yeah. If you live in that neighborhood and you hear those numbers on the local news, it sounds like an absolute environmental catastrophe.
The alarm from the community was entirely justified based on what was written in the permit. But here's the inconvenient reality that we have to volunteer because it challenges the standard narrative. When independent researchers actually set up monitors and measured the ambient air in the surrounding neighborhoods, the real-world effect on fine particulate pollution was an increase of only about 1%.
1%. So the doomsday scenario of everybody breathing in formaldehyde didn't actually materialize in the physical air. But why was there such a massive gap between the permit and reality?
Because permits are based on maximum theoretical usage, essentially assuming the worst-case scenario where everything runs constantly at full blast 24/7. The actual operation was far less intense. But the takeaway here isn't that gas generators are inherently harmless. The true regulatory failure is that nobody conducts continuous, mandatory ambient air monitoring.
Right.
Communities and tech companies are left to scream at each other in town halls over estimates and theoretical allowances in a permit, rather than arguing over empirical reality. If the county's paperwork simply demanded a continuous public air quality monitor on the fence line of the property, the fear vanishes. Everyone would know exactly what was happening in real time.
So we are seeing the cracks in the system everywhere. The phantom load on the grid, the evaporative cooling draining cheap water, the wells drying up without baseline tests. Communities are finally waking up to these dynamics, so how are they fighting back and how are the rules actually changing?
Well, there has been a massive political shift in just the last 12 months. Hundreds of bills have been introduced at the state and local levels to pause or heavily regulate data centers. But we need to be very careful with how we interpret the headlines here.
That is a trap we definitely need to avoid right here. If you follow tech news, you almost certainly saw the headline claiming that New York State banned data centers. Do not repeat that. New York did not ban data centers.
No, they didn't.
Yeah.
Governor Kathy Hochul issued an executive order that merely pauses state environmental permits for up to a year.
Right. They called a timeout, they looked at the board, realized they didn't have the right paperwork to protect their grid and their water, and they paused the game to write a proper regulatory framework so they don't get taken advantage of like Georgia did. There's also a proposal to repeal their sales tax exemptions, but that is just a proposal right now. It is not passed law. It is a pause, not a prohibition.
Exactly. But if you want to see the real laboratory for how to rewrite the rules effectively, you have to look at Texas.
Texas Senate Bill 6. This is the piece of legislation that every utility commissioner in the country is watching right now. Texas has the biggest pipeline of proposed data centers in the United States, and they decided they're simply not going to let everyday ratepayers absorb the financial risk of tech speculation.
And they were solving it through an incredibly elegant piece of paperwork. The state implemented a non-refundable interconnection fee of $50,000 per megawatt of contracted peak demand.
Okay, let's do the math on that so people understand the scale.
Yeah.
If a developer requests 100 megawatts from the grid, which is a decent-sized data center campus, they have to put down a non-refundable deposit of $5 million just to get in the queue.
Exactly. And that is the silver bullet for the phantom load problem we discussed earlier. Notice what Texas is doing here. They aren't banning data centers. They aren't trying to pick winners and losers in the AI race. They were just making optionality incredibly expensive. If a developer has to put down millions of hard, non-refundable dollars, all those speculative, imaginary projects drop out of the utility queue instantly.
Only the real projects remain. It's exactly like forcing that VIP to pay a $5 million non-refundable deposit for the restaurant reservation. Suddenly, they aren't going to no-show.
It converts a tech developer's wild optimism into a tangible financial responsibility. It solves the problem with prices and contracts, rather than clumsy government prohibition.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into the physical reality of the cloud, let's revisit that core anchor idea we started with.
The building is a constant. The paperwork is the variable.
We've seen it proven at every level today. We saw it with Loudoun County intelligently taxing the computer servers versus Georgia giving away the farm for projects that were coming anyway. We've seen it with the grid, whether everyday ratepayers subsidize an empty substation or the developer pays a non-refundable deposit to prove they are serious. We've seen it with water, whether it's priced properly to force a $31 million closed-loop system or priced too cheaply, leading to aquifer depletion for the sake of cheap cooling. And we've seen it with the Morris family, where a simple $300 baseline well test in the zoning paperwork would have changed the entire dynamic of a multi-million-dollar dispute.
And the final takeaway, the ultimate so what, for anyone listening, is that these buildings are coming regardless. The global demand for computation, for artificial intelligence, for cloud storage, it is not going to recede just because one county commission in the Midwest passes a resolution saying they don't like windowless buildings.
Right. Declining to build them in your specific town simply relocates the computation and the massive tax base that comes with it to another jurisdiction. It does not eliminate the demand for the technology.
Exactly. The only real question left is how we manage their arrival. We can either build this as planned infrastructure, which means pricing in the externalities, demanding non-refundable fees, and requiring mandatory baseline testing before ground is broken, Or we can let it arrive as a series of chaotic, speculative real estate transactions where every small town is forced to negotiate with a $500 million tech monopoly alone in the dark.
Think about the power dynamic at play here. If data centers are the literal, physical manifestation of the internet, what happens when rural counties finally realize they hold a geographic monopoly on the future of artificial intelligence? Because the AI doesn't work without the land and the power. Do these counties just keep competing in a race to the bottom, giving away tax breaks and water rights just to get a warehouse?
Or do they eventually figure this out, band together, and form a cartel to rewrite the paperwork entirely?
Exactly. They have the land, they have the power, they could set the terms. It is something to mull over the next time you casually ask an AI to write an email for you. You have
Yeah.
to ask yourself, is your roommate going to pay the rent or are they just going to eat all your groceries?